Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you share and really get into the context, the surprising details, and the deeper meaning of complex subjects. Today, we're charting a course through the formidable and fiercely independent life of Winslow Homer. He's this American visionary, and his path took him from, the repetitive grind of commercial engraving all the way to the profound solitary drama of the sea.
Yeah, we're looking at Winslow Homer, born 1836, died 1910. And he's consistently seen as, the key figure in American art in the late 19th century. What makes him so fascinating, I think, is that path. It was just defined by this radical independence. He mastered 3 completely different mediums: wood engraving, oil painting, and maybe most surprisingly, watercolor. And he did it all largely self-taught.
Right. So our mission today is to trace that artistic journey, that evolution. We're going to explore how his focus shifts so dramatically, from reporting the brutal realities of the Civil War to capturing the tensions of Reconstruction, and then finally landing on those incredibly powerful elemental sea paintings that really cemented his legacy. And crucially, we need to spend some real time understanding the why and maybe more importantly, the how behind his revolutionary use of watercolor.
Yeah.
It's a big piece of the puzzle.
It really is. And that foundation of independence, it actually starts close to home, back in Boston. Homer was the second of 3 sons. And the first big artistic influence, it was his mother, Henrietta Maria Benson Homer. She was a gifted amateur watercolorist, quite talented, apparently. And he seems to have inherited not just her artistic knack, but also her quiet, sort of reserved nature and that very specific, dry New England sense of humor.
Okay.
So that family background, the talent, plus the quiet strength, it feels pretty crucial for understanding the deep solitude he later embraced up in Maine.
Okay, let's unpack this early life a bit more, because there's this defining contrast, isn't there? Financially, anyway. On one side, you have Homer, who sounds self-reliant, quiet, and on the other, his father, Charles Savage Homer, volatile, restless, always chasing the next big fortune.
Exactly. And that constant instability from his father must have put immense pressure on young Winslow. His father left the family hardware store when Homer was just 13. Why? To join the California gold rush.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And when that inevitably failed, Charles just kept chasing these, frankly, disastrous schemes in Europe, always looking for capital, never finding it. So this pattern, this paternal financial failure, it meant Winslow had to learn self-reliance really young.
Right.
He knew he couldn't count on, inherited money or his dad's guidance. He had to make his own way, generate income, and fast.
Which leads him straight into commercial art.
Yeah.
So at 19, that's 1855, he gets an apprenticeship. J.H. Bufford's a Boston lithographer. And he later called this famously a treadmill experience.
Yeah, and we should emphasize that phrase, treadmill. A lithographic apprenticeship back then meant endless, repetitive commercial stuff. Designing sheet music covers, ads, that kind of thing. It was demanding technically, sure, but creatively, pretty deadening.
I can imagine.
But, and this is key, this is where he develops that foundational discipline, that technical skill that actually underpins his entire painting career later on.
He didn't stick with it for long, though, the apprenticeship itself. By 1857, he's already turning down a job offer, a secure staff position at Harper's Weekly, which was growing fast. And that decision, turning down steady work, that really cements this narrative of independence, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just no thanks. It was a real declaration of defiance, you could say. And that's when we get that famous quote, the ultimate statement of his artistic individualism. Yeah. From the time I took my nose off that lithographic stone, I have had no master and never shall have any.
Powerful stuff.
It really is. That fierce streak, that refusal to submit to a formal teacher or, the corporate structure of a big magazine, that was the engine driving him. He chose freelance work instead, opened his own studio right there in Boston.
But even though he turned down the staff job, he still worked for magazines like Harper's Weekly for a long time, right? Almost 20 years doing illustrations, mostly wood engravings. And he was successful pretty quickly, wasn't he? Because of those skills he'd honed.
Absolutely. That treadmill, those repetitive commercial jobs gave him exactly the graphic skills needed for wood engraving. Remember, that was the main way images got reproduced for mass media back then.
Right.
So his work stood out. Clean outlines, simplified forms, really dramatic contrasts of light and dark, lively figure groupings. These weren't just stylistic quirks. They were essential for getting a good, clear image printed on the presses of the day. And those same qualities, that clarity and contrast, you see them translate directly into his oil paintings later on.
Okay, so he's doing well with illustration, but he wants to pursue fine art seriously, which means needing to be where the action is, the center of the American art world. So 1859, he moves, opens a studio in the 10th Street Studio building in New York City. That was the place to be, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. The 10th Street Studio was it. The hub for artists, writers, publishers. And while he stuck to his no master idea, he wasn't totally isolated. He did take classes at the National Academy of Design for a few years, until about 1863, just learning the fundamentals.
Okay.
And he also studied painting basics, very briefly, with a guy named Frederick Rondell. But by all accounts, he was already producing work that went way beyond that basic training. He was, poised for something bigger. And then, well, national events kind of forced his hand.
Right. The Civil War. This is the next huge turning point.
Yeah.
It completely redirects his career. Harper sends him to the front lines. Suddenly, he's not just a freelance illustrator. He's a visual war reporter. He spends years, 1861 to 65, sketching not just the chaos of battle, but also, maybe more revealingly, the quiet, everyday moments of camp life.
Yeah, the first assignment was sketching McClellan's army, the Army of the Potomac, late in 61. And this work, it was dangerous, exhausting. It was the crucible, really, that forged him into a fine painter. He'd take those raw sketches, those immediate observations from the field, back to his New York studio. And there, he'd process them, translate them into these major oil paintings that really struck a chord with the public back home.
And those paintings basically made his reputation almost overnight, it seems. You see the shift with Sharpshooter on picket duty in 62. Very stark, unsentimental look at the sort of hidden violence of war. But the real breakthrough was Home Sweet Home, 1863.
Oh, Home Sweet Home was huge. It shows soldiers in camp listening to a band play the title song. Their faces, you see the nostalgia, the longing. Critics absolutely loved it. They praised its delicacy and strength of emotion, its hearty, homely actuality. It was a major statement of American realism, capturing genuine feeling through objective description, not through, over-the-top melodrama.
And that success, commercially and critically, it propelled him into the art establishment, didn't it? The sale of Home Sweet Home led directly to him being elected a full academician at the National Academy of Design in 1865. For the listener, what does that actually mean, being a full academician back then?
It's a big deal. It means you've been formally accepted into the highest ranks of American art. Being an academician meant you were recognized as a master. Your work helped define the nation's aesthetic standards.
So he's gone from commercial illustrator to establishment figure.
Pretty much. He was no longer just some talented illustrator. He was an established painter, confirmed by the very system he sort of claimed to reject. And he followed up quickly with another major painting, Prisoners from the Front, in 1866, which cemented that status. Critics noted the immediate maturity in these works, the emotional depth, but also that controlled, objective realism.
Okay, so connecting this to the bigger picture. The war ends, the trauma is immense, and Homer's subjects, kind of like the national mood, they start to shift. So you see a bit of a retreat into nostalgia, right? Those childhood scenes like Snap the Whip in 1872. But he also turns that same objective realism onto the most difficult, complex social issue of the time, Reconstruction.
Yeah, and this is where Homer's style really stands out, I think. Other artists might have slipped into caricature or sentimentality, especially when dealing with race and the aftermath of slavery. But Homer, his approach remains consistently objective, unsentimental. The sources actually credit him with providing the best, least caricatural portraits of postbellum African Americans, which is quite a statement.
Let's look at a key example of that tension, A Visit from the Old Mistress from 1876. It feels like a visual document of that awkward, silent power dynamic after emancipation.
Exactly right. The scene shows freed slaves encountering their former mistress, who's probably visiting the property they once worked. And look at how he composes it. The figures are standing almost equally weighted visually on the canvas. The former mistress is dressed formally, but the central figure of the formerly enslaved woman stands tall, holding this quiet dignity. The background is simple, sparse. It forces all your attention onto their body language, the space between them.
Yeah, the tension is palpable.
And the fact that the figures stand with what the critics called formal equivalence, that is the visual argument. It powerfully suggests that balance, that equilibrium the nation was hoping, often failing to find during Reconstruction. He captures all that complexity, that quiet tension, without any political shouting, just pure realism. It's radical in its own way.
And he explored similar themes later, too, like in Dressing for the Carnival in 1877.
Right. These works show him grappling with the nation's present, not just its past or its idealized future.
Okay, so before Homer starts that final big trajectory towards the sea, there's this brief European trip in 1867. What's really fascinating here is he goes to Paris for a year. This is peak Impressionism time, right? Monet are making waves. But Homer seems almost completely untouched by it, shows very little direct influence from those radical new French movements.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? I mean, technically, he was already a plein air painter. He painted outdoors, capturing light directly, which was a core idea for the Impressionists.
Yeah.
But thematically, he was miles away from the Parisian café scenes or landscapes. He seems to have connected more with the older French Barbizon school artists like Millet, who focused on peasant life, rural scenes. That resonated more.
So more gritty realism than shimmering light effect.
Exactly. The trip only resulted in about a dozen small paintings. It really just reinforces his commitment to his American subjects, his own path. He wasn't looking to Europe for validation or style.
Which just hammers home that fierce doctrine of independence again. He stayed incredibly private, guarded about his methods, his personal life. But the work itself screams individuality.
You really have to highlight that refusal to just follow the crowd. There's that philosophy, shared by his contemporary Eugene Benson, that artists should never look at pictures. Instead, they should stutter in a language of their own. Homer seemed determined to develop his own unique American voice, completely separate from European academic traditions or fleeting trends.
Okay, so that independent path hits a critical point in the mid-1870s. By 1875, he makes this huge decision. Maybe financially reckless looking back, he quits commercial illustration completely, vows to survive solely on his fine art.
And that was a massive gamble. I mean, yes, he had this great reputation, he was an academician, but his finances were still shaky. He's turning his back on the steady paycheck from illustration to pursue high art in a market that wasn't really mature yet, especially for American subjects. But that period of intense focus, it immediately pays off artistically. Breezing up, a fair win from 1876. It's shown at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Huge praise. The New York Tribune basically said nothing else there could compare to it.
Wow. So critical acclaim is there. But even with that skill being recognized, he still faced pushback, didn't he? Specifically about his subjects. We have that famous quote from the writer Henry James. He admits Homer incontestably succeeded in painting non-traditional scenes as if they were important. But then James says, we frankly confess that we detest his subjects.
Yeah, and that critique is so revealing because it tells you exactly what Homer was pushing against. Traditionally, painting had this strict hierarchy, history painting, biblical scenes, mythology at the top, then portraiture, then way down at the bottom, landscape and genre scenes, everyday life.
Right, the lesser forms.
Exactly. So by focusing on boy sailing or farm life or working women, Homer was deliberately rejecting that whole European academic taste. He was making a radical statement, really, a democratic American statement that ordinary life, objectively observed, was worthy of high art. And the traditional critics, like James, they just detested that idea.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting, and where Homer finds not only his defining medium, but also maybe a financial lifeline. Suddenly, 1873, he's spending the summer in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and he takes this decisive plunge into watercolor painting regularly.
And we can't overstate this. This wasn't just him trying out a different paint. It was an artistic revolution, especially in the American context. Before Homer, watercolor in the U.S., it was seen as secondary, suitable for light sketches, illustrations, maybe a nice hobby for ladies.
Right.
It just didn't have the seriousness, the weight of oil painting. Homer completely changed that perception.
How? How did he change it technically? What was different about his approach that made some early critics scoff? Like the one who said a child with an ink bottle could not have done worse. While at the same time, he's unlocking this incredible new potential in the medium.
Well, the big difference was in density and ambition. Traditional watercolors, especially the British style, relied on thin, transparent washes of color. You let the white of the paper shine through to create luminosity. It often gives a delicate, kind of ethereal look.
Okay.
Homer was different. He used pigment much more thickly, layering it almost like oil paint sometimes. And crucially, he often used opaque white pigment gouache mixed in.
Okay, that makes sense.
That allowed him to achieve real solidity, deep contrast, a sense of volume and density that just wasn't typical for watercolor before. He was treating the paper not like a sketchbook, but like a canvas, giving it substance.
And apparently he had this immediate knack for it. His technique was described as natural, fluid, and confident right from the start. So despite some initial hostile reviews, Those watercolors, they
Mhm.
were a hit financially.
A massive hit. They sold much more easily, much faster than his larger, more expensive oils. This really helped his financial situation after he'd given up illustration. It kind of validated his gamble on independence. He became so dedicated to it, apparently he rarely traveled anywhere after that without his watercolor supplies, paper, brushes, paints.
Now, this artistic shift seems to coincide with a personal one, too. Around the late 1870s, the sources mention possible emotional turmoil, maybe disappointments with women. He becomes much more reclusive, pulls back from the New York art scene.
Yeah, his solitude seems to have intensified quite a bit. He lived in Gloucester for a while, even stayed out at the Eastern Point Lighthouse with the keeper and his family. Very isolated.
Ah.
And in that reclusion, his subject matter changes again, decisively. He mostly abandons those scenes of fashionable, genteel women enjoying leisure time. Instead, he focuses almost entirely on working people, fishermen, farm women, and the marine environment itself. Elemental, often quite harsh.
And that path towards solitude in the sea culminates in a significant trip abroad, doesn't it? 2 years, 1881 to 1882, in Cullercoats, a fishing village in Northumberland, England.
Color coats. That was the real forge for the new Homer. This is where his mature style solidifies. He focuses entirely on the working life of the village, the fishermen braving the North Sea, and the women. He described them as stout, hardy creatures. You know, the ones waiting on shore, mending nets, doing the dangerous work associated with the fishing fleet.
And the style changed, too, reflecting these more serious, weighty subjects.
Absolutely. His color palette becomes much more constrained, more sober. Grays, blues, deep earth tones. The paintings themselves get larger, more ambitious compositionally, less spontaneous maybe than his earlier American watercolors. He's clearly moving toward these universal, almost heroic themes, the fundamental struggle of humanity against the power of nature. It's a huge conceptual leap, and it sets the stage for everything he does when he returns to the States.
Okay, so he comes back to the U.S. in late 1882, exhibits these new English watercolors. And a change is obvious.
Immediately obvious. Critics instantly noted it. They declared him a very different Homer. His pictures now touch a far higher plane. They are works of high art. That's a direct quote.
And the way he depicted women changed, too, based on those Cullercoats experiences.
Definitely. No more idealized country girls or fashionable ladies. The women in these English works were seen as sturdy, fearless, fit wives and mothers of men.
Wow.
You know, people who looked like they'd actually weathered life's storms. That transformation, that new sense of gravity and authority in his figures, it prepared everyone for his final, most iconic move.
Which was?
Bride's Neck, Maine. In 1883, he makes the definitive move, settles into his family's property there. They remodeled an old carriage house for him, just 75 feet from the Atlantic Ocean.
75 feet. That's close.
Right on the edge. And this is where he fully becomes, the legend. The Yankee Robinson Crusoe, the hermit with a brush.
That physical isolation must have been intense, but artistically crucial.
Absolutely key. So this raises the question, what did he achieve by cutting himself off like that in this raw, dramatic environment? The answer is pretty clear. He painted his greatest works, his most monumental seascapes. This is what cemented his status, without question, as the most original and one of the strongest of American painters.
But still, that recurring tension between critical acclaim and financial reality. Think about Undertow, 1886. Powerful painting, dramatic sea rescue. Critics are saying his figures now have the weight and authority of classical figures. High praise. Yet it only sold for $400.
Yeah, that $400 figure is kind of staggering when you think about it. He's at the absolute peak of his artistic powers. He's creating these works with the grandeur of Greek sculpture almost. Figures wrestling with fate, with nature's power. And he's still struggling to get significant money for his major oils. He was revered, yes, but the market hadn't fully caught up. He was still living pretty frugally.
You contrast that drama of Undertow with something like Eight Bells, also from 1886.
Right. Eight Bells is different. It shows two sailors on deck calmly taking their navigational readings during a storm. It's all about confidence, professionalism, that stoic composure in the face of the elements.
Skill versus nature.
Exactly. It emphasizes human skill and resilience against the sheer immensity of the ocean. That became a defining theme of his mature work. We also see it in paintings like The Fog Warning, that sense of suspense and respect for the sea.
Now, Maine was his base, his spiritual home, maybe. But he didn't just stay there all year round, did he? especially in winter. He started traveling South Florida, Cuba, the Bahamas, often on commission for Century magazine, starting around 1884-85.
Yeah, these tropical trips were really important. They refreshed his eye, his palette, his technique. He consciously swapped the, turbulent green storm-tossed sea of Prout's Neck
Yeah.
for the brilliant blues, turquoise waters, and intense sunlight of the Caribbean.
Must have been a shock to the system, visually.
Had to be. And it forced him to really expand his watercolor technique even further to capture that intense light and color. You can think of these trips a bit like Gauguin going to Tahiti, a source of vibrant, maybe exotic inspiration that recharged his batteries.
And his subjects changed, too, in these tropical settings. Fewer hardy New England fishermen, more scenes with black locals, like A Garden in Nassau from 1885. The light and color feel radically different from the Maine paintings.
Radically different. These tropical watercolors are just dazzling displays of light and fluid technique. But again, that old story. They were praised by critics for their freshness, their originality, but they still didn't sell easily.
Still too advanced for popular taste.
Seems like it. They were maybe too modern, too direct for many buyers at the time. It just reinforces that lifelong pattern. Critically vital, commercially slow, which meant he had to live carefully, sometimes getting financial help from his brother Charles, who was much more successful in business.
He kept going back south, though. Key West was a frequent spot until about 1903. Produced great works like A Norther, Key West. And then, in 1899, comes what many consider his most profound, maybe most disturbing painting, the Gulf Stream.
The Gulf Stream. Yeah, that's the ultimate statement of his move towards naturalism, towards depicting what you might call the Darwinian struggle for survival. The painting shows a lone black sailor adrift on a broken, rudderless boat. The mast is snapped. The deck is covered in sugarcane stalks, not food, just cargo. He's surrounded by circling sharks in a blood-tinged sea.
And there's that water spout in the distance.
Right, that looming water spout, a symbol of inevitable, catastrophic natural force bearing down on him. It's incredibly bleak.
It feels a million miles away from, say, Snap the Whip, those idyllic childhood scenes in the 1870s.
Yeah.
How does a painting like the Gulf Stream fit into the broader thinking of the late 19th century?
Well, it connects directly to the era's growing focus on scientific observation, on naturalism, on survival of the fittest, you could say. Homer's shift away from nostalgia towards this kind of raw conflict reflects a wider cultural move away from Victorian sentimentality. It's about acknowledging the indifference, even the brutality of nature.
Unflinching.
Totally unflinching. He presents this human struggle against overwhelming forces without any heroism, without any sentiment. The man isn't battling the elements, he's simply facing inevitable natural processes. It's objective, it's powerful, and it's chilling.
Right.
And it feels like something only possible because of the isolation he cultivated in Maine.
That theme, survival against the odds, nature's harshness.
Yeah.
It's also incredibly intense in his largest painting, isn't it? The Fox Hunt from 1893.
Oh, the fox hunt is brutal. A fox struggling through deep snow, being hunted not by humans, but by a flock of starving crows descending from this bleak winter sky.
Yeah, it's grim.
Pure struggle. Life and death. But despite that unsettling theme, it was a major career milestone for him. It was the first painting of his bought by a major American museum, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Finally. It signaled his complete, unquestioned acceptance into the absolute top tier of American art. An acceptance that took him decades of fiercely independent work to achieve.
So he finally finds real financial stability later in life, around 1900. Partly through museum sales, but also, ironically, through things like real estate investments.
Yeah, it seems success finally caught up with him financially in his last decade or so, and he kept painting those iconic Prout's Neck seascapes, waves crashing against the rocks right up until the end. Those late seascapes are just pure power. They distill the essence of the ocean, its force, its permanence.
And he kept that dry humor, that independent spirit, too. There's that quote from 1907.
Right. Advising a student, leave rocks for your old age. They're easy. Classic Homer. He died in his Prout's Neck studio in 1910. He was still working, actually left a painting called Shooting the Rapids, Saguenay River, unfinished on his easel, painting right to the last.
So, looking back at the legacy, his achievement in watercolor is often singled out, isn't it? As unparalleled, really transformative for the medium.
Absolutely. By using gouache-thick pigment, treating the paper structurally, the sources agree he had used his singular vision and manner of painting to create a body of work that has not been matched. He proved definitively that watercolor could have the same power, the same philosophical depth as oil painting. He elevated it permanently.
And even though he famously refused to teach, sticking to that no master idea, his work itself became incredibly influential for generations of American artists that followed.
Hugely influential. His work was admired for its directness, its honesty, its integrity of nature, as Robert Henri, a key figure in the next generation's Ashkin School, called it.
Right.
And you can trace a direct line of influence. The great illustrator Howard Pyle revered Homer. Pyle's most famous student was N.C. Wyeth. And Wyeth was so inspired by Homer's approach to nature and light that he, too, moved to Maine for inspiration.
Wow, that's a direct lineage.
It is. And that inspiration carried right through the Wyeth family, Andrew Wyeth, Jamie Wyeth, all following in the footsteps, in a way, of the Hermit of Prout's Neck.
And Homer's presence is still tangible today, isn't it? Physically and in the public eye. That Prout's Neck studio is still there, maintained as a National Historic Landmark by the Portland Museum of Art. People can visit it.
Yeah, it's become a kind of pilgrimage site. And his images are just cemented in American culture. The post office has put him on stamps multiple times. Breezing Up back in '62. Boys in a Pasture more recently in 2010. It's kind of fitting, isn't it? The guy who started out making commercial illustrations for mass reproduction ends up being mass reproduced on postage stamps decades after his death.
So let's try to wrap this up. What does it all mean? When you look at Winslow Homer's life, his whole arc, it's an incredible journey. From that treadmill experience in commercial engraving, through the crucible of the Civil War, the complexities of Reconstruction, to finally becoming this singular, independent master of the elemental landscape, especially the sea. His career really feels like a testament to the power of self-teaching, dedication, objective observation, and just a stubborn refusal to follow the rules.
I think that's exactly right. His whole philosophy boiled down to that radical independence, that advice he gave, look at nature, work independently, and solve your own problems. It sums him up perfectly. He rejected the formulas, the academic hierarchies to forge his own visual language, and it was a language powerful enough to capture the most profound struggles between humanity and the natural world.
And what really stands out for me from this deep dive is that constant underlying tension. The tension between his immense critical importance, his artistic value, and his decades-long financial struggle. He's being called the most original and strongest of American painters, but he's barely scraping by selling masterpieces.
Precisely. He spends 20 years doing commercial work, then deliberately walks away from it, vowing to survive on fine art alone. And he accepts the consequences, the precarious finances, needing help from his brother sometimes. We've seen how his career required these dramatic shifts, leaving success behind, facing criticism for his unworthy subjects or his unconventional medium like watercolor. So, here's something for you, the listener, to think about. What does Homer's lifelong commitment to finding his own language, even when it meant being broke or misunderstood? What does that tell you about the true cost, maybe the true value, of artistic integrity and self-definition? Especially today, when creative work is always being weighed against commercial demands.
A question as vast and deep as the ocean Homer painted.
Yeah.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.